picture this. Your mother-in-law suffers a massive stroke. Overnight, she goes from independent to wheelchair-bound. Suddenly, things most of us take for granted, like walking up 3 steps to a front door, turn into impossible barriers. So you do what any decent human would do. You decide to bring her into your home to care for her. You look at those steps out front, realize they're a problem, and think, easy fix, let's add a ramp. Simple, practical, compassionate, right? Enter the HOA. Instead of a heartfelt, of course, let's make the neighborhood accessible, this family in California received a letter, not a warm letter of support, not even a polite request for contractor details. Nope, a flat-out denial stamped with HOA authority. The reason? Unsightly. And oh yes, it would lower property values, because apparently in HOA world, concrete steps are a national treasure, but ramps for disabled family members are a mortal threat to suburban aesthetics. You can almost hear the conversation in the boardroom. Folks, we've got an emergency. Someone wants to add a ramp for a stroke victim. What? A ramp? Out front? Think of the resale values. Quick, deny it before empathy spreads. That's how absurd this sounds when you strip it down. A ramp isn't a luxury, it's a necessity. We're not talking about adding a neon green water slide to the roof or turning the front yard into a petting zoo. We're talking about a straightforward, functional slope of wood or concrete that allows a grandmother to get into her own home with dignity. But here's the kicker. The HOA tried to push the family into building the ramp in the backyard. Think about that for a second. The mother-in-law, in a wheelchair, is supposed to circle around the house, roll through grass, gravel, maybe mud, maybe sprinklers, just to get inside. That's not accommodation, it's humiliation. It's the equivalent of saying, sure, you can come to dinner, but you've got to crawl through the doggy door first. Now, why does this even matter? Because what looks like one petty neighborhood dispute is actually a classic example of how HOAs overstep their authority and completely ignore federal law. And it's not just one case. Lawyers across the country report a pattern. HOAs love to hide behind aesthetic uniformity as an excuse. That's lawyer speak for, we want all the houses to look the same, even if it means discriminating against someone with a disability. And here's the fun part. Courts don't buy it. Under the Fair Housing Act, families are guaranteed the right to make reasonable modifications for disabled residents. And what's the number one, most obvious, most textbook example of a reasonable modification? You guessed it, a wheelchair ramp. Courts have upheld this again and again. Exterior ramps, widened doorways, even walkways expanded to 36 inches are all considered reasonable. So when an HOA says unsightly, the law essentially replies irrelevant. But here's where things get extra messy. Instead of rolling up their sleeves and saying, how can we make this safe and compliant? Some HOAs dig in, forcing homeowners into legal fights. And let's be real, most families don't want to spend thousands of dollars and months of stress battling their HOA just to build something so basic. That's how HOAs get away with this nonsense. They bank on people being too exhausted, too broke, or too intimidated to fight back. Yet, this family didn't just shrug. They went online, shared their story on Reddit, and asked the million-dollar question, is this even legal? And that's the heart of why this story matters. It's not just about one ramp. It's about the bigger clash between compassion and bureaucracy, rights and rules, dignity and property values. And let's pause on that last phrase, property values. It's the HOA's favorite weapon, wielded like a sword every time they want to shut down a request. But let's be brutally honest. Does anyone really believe a simple, well-built ramp tanks a neighborhood's value? Are buyers touring homes saying, oh, this place is perfect, great schools, nice kitchen, but yikes, a ramp? Pass. Of course not. If anything, ramps broaden appeal for families who need accessibility, but HOAs cling to this myth like it's written on stone tablets. So here's where we land. A family trying to do the right thing, an HOA obsessed with curb appeal, and a law that clearly sides with accessibility. It's the perfect storm of neighborhood drama, and the opening shot in what could become a full-blown legal war. But if you thought the setup was outrageous, just wait until you see the receipts, because the law doesn't just quietly frown at HOAs who pull this stunt, it calls them out by name. Enter the Fair Housing Act, stage left, ready to smack down the unsightly ramp excuse once and for all. Now that we've set the stage with an HOA wielding unsightly like it's a legitimate legal defense, let's introduce the star witness who's about to shut that nonsense down, the Fair Housing Act. If HOAs had a list of natural enemies, the FHA would be at the top, right next to people who paint their garage doors beige instead of desert sand tan number 47. So, what does this law actually say? In short, housing providers, which includes HOAs, condo boards, and landlords, must allow reasonable modifications and accommodations for people with disabilities. Let's underline that. Must allow. Not should, not if it doesn't clash with your taste in landscaping. Must. Period. And a ramp? That's not some fringe request. It's practically the poster child for reasonable modification. In fact, when lawyers talk about the FHA, ramps are often the first example they give. It's Accessibility 101. It's so textbook that if you're an HOA board member who still denies a ramp, you might as well staple a sign to your forehead that says, "Please sue me." Attorney Chad Cummings put it clearly. The FHA requires HOAs to allow these modifications. Another lawyer, David Cohen, drives it home. You can't deny a ramp request just because it alters the exterior appearance. Think about that. If an HOA tries to argue, well, we don't like how it looks, the law basically shrugs and says, tough. That's not an argument. It's discrimination dressed in designer jeans. But here's the part that always amazes me. Even with the law crystal clear, HOAs still stonewall. Cummings says he's seen it time and time again. HOAs hiding behind aesthetic uniformity, like it's their get-out-of-jail-free card. Sorry, folks, there is no monopoly rule book in federal housing law. Courts have consistently smacked this excuse down. Ramps, widened 32-inch doorways, 36-inch walkways, all have been deemed reasonable. If the modification allows a disabled person to actually access and use their home, then it's legal. Full stop. Now, you might wonder, why does the FHA even need to exist for something so obvious? Shouldn't common decency cover it? In a perfect world, yes. But in HOA land, common decency often gets voted down at the annual meeting. That's why Congress had to step in and spell it out. You can't keep someone from living in their own home just because you think ramps clash with the neighborhood vibe. Let's put this into a real-world analogy. Imagine you're at a restaurant. Someone at the next table has a peanut allergy. They ask the waiter to skip the peanuts in their dish. Reasonable, right? Now, imagine the waiter says, "Sorry, that would alter the aesthetic presentation of the plate. We care about uniformity here." Sounds insane, doesn't it? That's the HOA logic when they deny a ramp. And here's a fun kicker. When HOAs ignore the FHA, they don't just risk losing in court, they risk paying damages, legal fees, and penalties. HUD, the Department of Housing and Development, can investigate, mediate, and order compliance. Translation, an HOA can go from feeling powerful to feeling broke real fast. But let's give credit where credit is due. The FHA doesn't give homeowners a blank check. Not every request is automatically reasonable. If you wanted to bulldoze the neighborhood pool to make parking easier for one resident, that would cross the line. The law is about balance, reasonable needs versus community impact. But again, ramps? They're the definition of balance. Minimal disruption, maximum dignity. So when our California couple asked for one, the legal answer wasn't complicated. The HOA had to allow it. By denying it, they didn't just look heartless, they looked clueless.
Because the FHA has receipts, and the courts have already seen this movie a dozen times. Spoiler alert, the HOA never wins in the end. But maybe you're wondering, okay, so HOAs can't ban ramps, but what can they regulate? Great question, because while the law ties their hands on discrimination, it does let them tinker at the edges. Let's break down what HOAs can and can't control when it comes to accessibility.
At this point, you're probably thinking, so HOAs can't ban ramps at all? They just have to sit back and watch while someone builds whatever they want? Not quite. The law isn't telling HOAs to hand over the keys to the kingdom. It just says they can't use discrimination as their home decor strategy. They do have some power, but it's limited. And more importantly, it's meant to be reasonable. So what does reasonable look like in practice? Let's break it down. First, HOAs can absolutely require homeowners to follow basic safety rules. You can't slap together a ramp out of 2x4s from your cousin's shed, nail it to the house at a crooked angle, and call it a day. The HOA can insist you hire a licensed contractor, get the proper city permits, and follow building codes. After all, nobody wants grandma wheeling up the ramp only to launch into orbit because it wasn't built at the right slope. Second, HOAs can enforce aesthetic adjustments, but only minor ones. They can ask you to paint the ramp to match the house's trim, or use materials that don't look like they were stolen from a construction site dumpster. What they can't do is deny the ramp outright or make demands so extreme they defeat the whole purpose. For example, if the HOA says, sure, you can have a ramp, but only if it's built out of marble imported from Italy and shaped like Michelangelo's David, that's not an accommodation, that's sabotage. Third, HOAs can require you to pay for the modification yourself. That's right, the cost falls on the homeowner, not the association. It may not be fair, but it's the law. The silver lining is that you control the project. The HOA can't drag its feet and claim they'll get to it eventually. If you need it, you can build it, so long as you follow the rules. Now here's what HOAs can't do. They can't say, build the ramp in the backyard. That's not an accommodation, that's obstruction. They can't demand you use an alternate entrance, unless you've got a back door wide enough, paved pathways, and equal access, which 99% of homes don't. They also can't enforce rules that effectively delay accessibility. If your mother-in-law is coming home from rehab next week, the HOA can't say, we'll review your application in 6 months. That's not a review, that's a blockade. Another thing HOAs can't do is use property values as their trump card. Courts have made it crystal clear. The convenience of the community does not outweigh the rights of a disabled individual. Saying your ramp will hurt home prices is like saying your neighbor's solar panels make me sad. Feelings don't override federal law. And let's not forget the favorite HOA trick, drowning you in paperwork. Some HOAs love to delay by demanding extra forms, surveys, or architectural committee reviews. But under the Fair Housing Act, delays can equal denial. If the HOA is dragging its feet without legitimate reasons, they're breaking the law. And if it ever makes it to court, judges tend to look at these stalling tactics the same way a teacher looks at the kid who swears the dog ate their homework. Here's where it gets ironic. HOAs actually have the power to make this process smooth, cooperative, and even community-friendly. They could say, we'll approve your ramp as long as it meets safety codes and matches the house. Everyone wins. Instead, too many HOAs go full villain mode, thinking they're defending property values when they're really just inviting a lawsuit. Think of it like this. The HOA is allowed to set the stage, but they don't get to cancel the play. They can choose the color of the curtains, but they can't stop the performance. They can regulate the how, but not the if. So yes, HOAs have some power here, but it's not the power they think they have. They're not kings guarding a castle, they're more like referees. And the referee's job is to keep the game fair, not to ban players they don't like. And here's the million-dollar question. What happens when the HOA ignores these rules and doubles down anyway? That's when homeowners need to gear up for battle, because fighting back isn't just possible, it's your right. Let's talk about how to push back when your HOA plays hardball.
So the HOA has denied your ramp.
They've flexed their little bit of authority, thrown unsightly around like it's a legal term, and maybe even suggested your wheelchair-bound family member should enter through the backyard like a pizza delivery guy. What now? Do you give up and resign yourself to lifting grandma over the steps every day like you're competing in the world's strongest man competition? Nope. This is when you go on the offensive. Step 1, document everything. And I mean everything. Keep copies of letters, emails, meeting minutes. Heck, even scribble down what was said in phone calls. The moment you make a written request for a modification, the HOA is legally on the hook. Think of it like hitting record on a reality TV show. You want receipts for when the drama inevitably explodes. Step 2, formalize the request. Don't just casually mention it at the pool or slip it into small talk during the annual barbecue. Draft a clear, written request for a reasonable modification under the Fair Housing Act. Use those words. They're like garlic to a vampire when it comes to HOAs. Once they see the magic legal phrase, they know you've done your homework and aren't just winging it. Step 3, if they deny it, escalate. You've got 2 main weapons here, HUD and the courts. With HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, you can file a complaint within 1 year of the violation. HUD can investigate, mediate, and even force the HOA to comply. Think of HUD as the big sibling you call when the playground bully won't stop bullying. And the best part? HUD investigations are often free for the complainant. Step 4, lawsuit time. Under the Fair Housing Act, you've got up to 2 years to sue in federal court. And here's where it gets fun. If you win, the HOA doesn't just have to let you build the ramp, they may have to pay your legal fees too. Nothing takes the smug smile off an HOA board faster than realizing they funded both sides of the fight. Step 5, public pressure. Don't underestimate the power of community shaming. HOAs hate bad press more than they hate mismatched mailbox paint. If you're denied, share your story on social media, with local news outlets, even at town meetings. Nothing rattles an HOA like seeing its name in headlines next to words like discrimination and wheelchair. It's amazing how quickly boards discover their flexibility when reporters start asking questions. Now, some people worry, won't fighting back make things worse? Won't the HOA retaliate? Maybe. But here's the thing. Retaliation for asserting your rights under the Fair Housing Act is also illegal. If the HOA suddenly starts fining you for leaving your trash can out for an extra hour while ignoring everyone else's cans, guess what? That's more ammo for your case. Retaliation just digs them deeper into the hole. But let's be real. Most homeowners don't want to spend years in legal trench warfare. That's why it's smart to start with negotiation. Propose reasonable compromises, materials that blend in, landscaping that softens the look, contractor guarantees. If the HOA still refuses, then you've proven you tried to play nice. Judges love that. They hate when one side looks stubborn and unreasonable. And trust me, 9 times out of 10, that side is the HOA. And here's a fun little twist. HOAs themselves carry insurance for this kind of dispute. That means when they lose, and they almost always do, it's not just the board members sweating. The whole neighborhood could end up footing the bill through higher dues. That's when the same neighbors who didn't care about your ramp suddenly care a lot about holding the board accountable. Nothing mobilizes a community faster than the words special assessment. So your playbook is clear. Document, request, escalate, publicize, and, if necessary, sue. You don't have to roll over just because a handful of board members think accessibility clashes with their vision of suburban utopia. You've got rights, you've got the law, and you've got more leverage than you think. But here's the kicker. HOAs love to dress discrimination in fancy clothes. They'll say, "We're not against ramps, we just care about aesthetics." Sounds polite, right? Except courts have already shredded that excuse. Let's talk about why the ugly ramp defense is legally worthless.
If HOAs had a greatest hits album, It's Unsightly would be track 1, side A. Every time a homeowner requests something practical, solar panels, satellite dishes, wheelchair ramps, board members dust off their favorite word, aesthetics. Because in HOA land, looking good on the outside apparently matters more than functioning on the inside. Take our California ramp case. The board didn't say, "We're concerned about safety," or "Please provide engineering specs." Nope. Their reason for rejection was pure fashion critique, unsightly, and property values. Because clearly, a gentle wooden ramp is uglier than watching a grandmother struggle to get into her own home. Makes sense, right? Here's the problem. Courts have already shredded this excuse. Judges don't care if the board thinks ramps clash with the neighborhood's Tuscan villa theme. The Fair Housing Act is crystal clear. Accessibility rights outweigh curb appeal every single time. A ramp isn't optional decor, it's a necessity. And necessities don't need a beauty contest to be valid. Lawyers who fight these battles see the aesthetic card all the time. Attorney David Cohen explained it perfectly. HOAs often try to disguise discrimination as design preference. But when you strip away the polite language, what's left is ugly. We'd rather your disabled relatives struggle than our streetscape lose its symmetry. Try pitching that to a jury. And here's where it gets even funnier. Studies have shown that accessibility modifications like ramps or widened walkways don't actually hurt property values. In some cases, they make a home more marketable because the buyer pool widens to include families who need those features. So the HOA's protecting values argument isn't just legally flimsy, it's economically wrong. They're fighting ramps the same way people once fought elevators in buildings, out of pure ignorance. Let's put this into perspective. Imagine a fire department refusing to install hydrants because the red paint didn't match the neighborhood palette, or a city banning streetlights because they didn't blend with the rustic vibe. That's how ridiculous HOAs sound when they say ramps are unsightly. Function beats form when people's safety and dignity are on the line. The other angle HOAs love to spin is uniformity. They argue that if they allow one ramp, suddenly everyone will want to add quirky features and the whole community will collapse into architectural chaos. Newsflash, nobody's lining up to build unnecessary ramps just for fun. Accessibility modifications are not contagious. Allowing one doesn't mean your cul-de-sac will turn into a carnival midway overnight. And here's the kicker. The Fair Housing Act doesn't just tolerate ramps, it basically expects them. Ramps are one of the most common, reasonable, and necessary modifications. Courts have ruled on cases where HOAs try to force ramps into backyards, behind bushes, or even underground. Yes, really. And the verdict is always the same. Nope. Accessibility comes first. Aesthetic whining comes last. But let's play devil's advocate for a second. Suppose an HOA actually has a legitimate concern, like making sure the ramp doesn't block a fire hydrant or stick dangerously into the street. That's fair. Those concerns can be solved with good design. What's not fair is using ugly as a veto stamp. That's like telling someone they can't wear glasses because they ruin the vibe of family photos. And here's where HOAs often shoot themselves in the foot. By denying ramps based on looks, they don't just violate the FHA, they risk massive fines, legal fees, and bad press. And nothing destroys property values faster than a viral news story about how your community discriminates against wheelchair users. So in trying to protect the neighborhood, HOAs often end up trashing it in the most public way possible. At the end of the day, aesthetics are subjective, but rights are not. You might not like the look of a ramp, but that doesn't give you the power to deny someone their dignity. And that's why the unsightly excuse is legally worthless and morally embarrassing.
So if aesthetics won't save an HOA, what will? Spoiler, not much. But homeowners do need to know the bottom line: what rights they have, what responsibilities they carry, and how to play this game without losing their sanity. Let's land this plane with some hard truths about accessibility, law, and life under HOA rules.
All right, let's bring this down from the legal mountaintop and into the trenches of everyday life. Because at the end of the day, you're not a lawyer, you're not HUD, and you're not trying to audition for HOA Survivor. You're just someone who wants to take care of your family without starting a war over 3 feet of concrete. So, what does the bottom line actually look like for homeowners caught in this kind of nonsense? First, let's talk rights. The Fair Housing Act is your shield. It guarantees you the right to make reasonable modifications for a disabled person living in or regularly visiting your home. That includes ramps, wider doors, grab bars, accessible walkways, you name it. As long as it's tied to disability access and doesn't fundamentally alter the neighborhood, spoiler, ramps don't, you're covered. No HOA, no board member with a power trip, no neighbor with aesthetic concerns can legally stop you. Second, responsibilities. Here's the part HOAs love to gloss over when they try to scare homeowners. You do have to pay for the ramp yourself. The HOA doesn't fund it, and they don't have to help maintain it once it's in. That might sting, but look at the silver lining. Since you're footing the bill, you control the project. You get to choose the contractor, the materials, and the design, within reason. The HOA can request tweaks, but they can't hijack the build. It's your project, your dime, and your rights. Third, let's talk reality. Fighting an HOA isn't fun. Even with the law on your side, they'll drag their feet, send passive-aggressive letters, and try to make you feel like you're the neighborhood troublemaker. It's exhausting, and that's exactly the point. HOAs survive on fatigue. Most people just give up. But here's the secret. Persistence pays. The more you document, the more you push, the more you call their bluff, the faster their house of cards collapses. Here's another reality check. If you fight and win, you're not just helping your family. You're setting a precedent for everyone else in the neighborhood. You're the trailblazer who proves ramps are legal, reasonable, and untouchable by HOA pettiness. Suddenly, your fight isn't just personal, it's community-wide. The next family that needs a modification, their path is easier because you paved the way. Literally. Now, let's talk strategy. If you're in this situation, here's your playbook. Request in writing. Use the phrase, reasonable modification under the Fair Housing Act. That's your magic spell. Offer compromises. Suggest paint colors, landscaping, or materials that blend in. Courts love homeowners who play nice. Escalate when denied. HUD complaint first, lawsuit if needed. Don't skip steps. Show the paper trail. Rally allies. Talk to sympathetic neighbors. Bad PR spreads fast in a subdivision, and HOAs hate it. Stay calm. Nothing feeds an HOA's power trip like you losing your cool. Be steady, be polite, but be firm. And here's a pro tip. HOAs love to say they're protecting property values. Turn that argument back on them. Remind them that nothing tanks values faster than a discrimination lawsuit plastered all over the evening news. Accessibility isn't a liability, it's a selling point. By denying your ramp, they're not protecting home values, they're actively threatening them. At the end of the day, the bottom line for homeowners is simple. You have more power than you think. The law is on your side. The courts are on your side, and if push comes to shove, the community will be on your side too. Because nobody wants to live in the neighborhood that makes grandmas crawl through the backyard. But here's where things get spicy. Because knowing your rights is one thing, but watching HOAs actually break those rights in real-world cases,
that's a whole different show. Let's dive into some real-world horror stories where the unsightly ramp excuse didn't just get laughed out of court, it cost HOAs big time.
If you think the California ramp fiasco was outrageous, buckle up, because HOAs across the country have been waging a low-key war against ramps for years, and the receipts are jaw-dropping. These aren't isolated misunderstandings, they're full-on battles where homeowners had to drag their HOAs kicking and screaming into compliance, sometimes in front of judges who looked like they wanted to bang their gavels through the bench. Take the case out of Florida. A homeowner wanted to install a simple ramp for his disabled wife. The HOA denied it, citing, you guessed it, aesthetic concerns. The family fought back under the Fair Housing Act, and the court didn't just side with them. It roasted the HOA and the judgment. The ramp went up, the HOA paid damages, and suddenly, unsightly wasn't a word anyone on that board wanted to hear again. Then there's the New Jersey case where an HOA demanded a disabled veteran put his ramp at the back of the house. The man had served his country, came home needing accessibility, and the HOA basically told him to sneak in like a delivery guy. When the case went public, the backlash was so brutal that the HOA had to reverse course almost overnight. And let's be real, nothing unites a community faster than seeing a veteran disrespected by a bunch of clipboard warriors. Or how about the Texas HOA that actually tried to find a homeowner every single day the ramp remained up? Their argument was that the ramp violated architectural harmony. The homeowner filed with HUD, and the feds swooped in like an eagle on a cheeseburger. Not only was the ramp declared legal, but the HOA had to cough up a settlement and rewrite its policies to comply with federal law. Nothing says architectural harmony like a giant federal penalty check. These stories all highlight the same pattern. HOAs acting like they're the Supreme Court of aesthetics, only to get smacked down by actual courts that care about human rights. The irony? Most of these boards could have avoided lawsuits entirely if they just followed the law from the start. Instead, they doubled down, wasted everyone's time and money, and trashed their own reputations. And here's the delicious twist. HOAs often think they're scaring homeowners into compliance, but once the media gets wind of a wheelchair ramp denial, it's the HOA that becomes the villain. Local news eats this stuff up. Headlines like, HOA blocks ramp for stroke victim, or veteran denied wheelchair access by neighborhood board are PR nightmares. No one cares about your Tuscan-inspired design palette when grandma can't get through the front door. It's not just about bad press, though. These cases set legal precedents. Every time a judge rules that ramps are reasonable, it strengthens the position of the next homeowner who faces an HOA word block. It builds a paper trail that future lawyers can slam on the table and say, see, we've been here before, and the HOA lost. And let's not forget the money. Legal fees, settlements, fines, these add up. And who pays for them? The HOA's insurance, sure, but also the homeowners through higher dues. Imagine being the neighbor who didn't care about the ramp, but now has to pay $200 more a year because your board decided aesthetics were more important than federal law. Suddenly, those neighbors start showing up to board meetings with pitchforks. Metaphorically, we hope. So the horror stories are a warning. For homeowners, they're proof you can win if you push back. For HOAs, they're a flashing neon sign. Stop hiding behind unsightly and start following the law. Because the longer you fight, the worse it gets for your wallet, your reputation, and your supposed property values. Transition to fact 8. But these aren't just random skirmishes. They're symptoms of a bigger problem. Because the ramp debate isn't really about wood, concrete, or aesthetics. It's about power. So let's pull back the curtain on why HOAs fight so hard over things they're destined to lose.
At this point, you might be asking yourself, why? Why would an HOA willingly walk into legal quicksand over something as basic as a wheelchair ramp? It's not like board members wake up in the morning thinking, how can I ruin a disabled person's day today? Or do they? The truth is more complicated and more entertaining. HOAs love power. Not big, world-changing power like presidents or prime ministers. We're talking tiny, suburban fiefdom power, the kind where someone who got picked last in high school gym class now gets to decide what shade of beige your shutters can be. For some people, that authority is intoxicating, and nothing threatens that authority faster than a homeowner standing up and saying, actually, federal law outranks your paint swatches. Let's break it down. HOAs thrive on uniformity. They sell themselves on the promise that your neighborhood will look neat, tidy, and harmonious, like a Pottery Barn catalog where nobody leaves their trash cans out too long. To them, a ramp is more than just a ramp. It's a symbol of disorder, proof that individual needs can overwrite collective rules. And once one person breaks the aesthetic code, they fear the dominoes will fall. First ramps, then solar panels, then, heaven forbid, pink flamingo lawn ornaments. But underneath that obsession with order lies a deeper issue: control. HOAs aren't really about property values. That's just the marketing. They're about giving a small group of people the ability to regulate everyone else's lives. Denying a ramp isn't about the ramp, it's about reminding homeowners who's in charge. It's the board saying, you don't make changes without our blessing. Of course, this illusion of control collapses the moment the law steps in, because in the hierarchy of authority, federal civil rights laws outrank your HOA's covenants, conditions, and restrictions. Yet many boards operate like they're untouchable kings instead of volunteer committees with limited power. That gap between perception and reality is where the drama lives. And here's where the irony is. Fighting ramps doesn't even help HOAs maintain control. It makes them look petty, weak, and out of touch. It exposes the board's obsession with micromanagement, turning them into the neighborhood villains instead of the protectors they pretend to be. Ask anyone who's ever lived under a strict HOA. The board members who nitpick mailbox heights and lawn edges are the same ones who lose their minds when a ramp shows up. It's not about aesthetics, it's about their fragile sense of authority. Let's also consider fear of precedent. Boards worry that if they allow one ramp, they'll have to allow every request. But that's not how the law works. The Fair Housing Act only requires reasonable modifications for people with disabilities. That doesn't mean your neighbor can suddenly demand a moat and drawbridge because he feels medieval. Each case is judged on necessity, not whim. The slippery slope argument is pure paranoia, but it keeps HOAs clutching their pearls like Victorian fainting ladies. Finally, there's the ego factor. HOA board positions are unpaid, often thankless, and mostly involve chasing people about weeds or overdue dues. When something bigger comes along, like a legal fight, it gives certain board members the thrill of importance. Suddenly, they're not just neighborhood volunteers, they're defenders of community standards. Never mind that those standards are trampling on civil rights, the ego boost is too tempting. So why do HOAs fight? Because they confuse aesthetics with authority, uniformity with dignity, and power with purpose. They'd rather cling to their illusion of control than admit the law has already decided the outcome. It's not rational, but it's very, very human. And here's where things take an even bigger turn, because while these fights might look small and petty, they're actually tied to a national conversation about accessibility and civil rights. Let's zoom out and see how HOA ramp wars connect to the bigger picture. It's easy to dismiss HOA ramp battles as petty neighborhood squabbles, just another episode in the never-ending sitcom of suburban life. But scratch the surface, and you'll see these conflicts are actually part of a much bigger, much older fight: the ongoing struggle for civil rights and accessibility. Let's start with the basics. The Fair Housing Act, FHA, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, aren't just dusty laws gathering cobwebs in legal textbooks. They're milestones in the civil rights movement, direct descendants of the same energy that pushed for racial equality, women's rights, and broader human dignity. They exist because history taught us that when left to their own devices, communities don't always choose fairness. Sometimes they choose convenience, and sometimes they choose aesthetics over accessibility. Sound familiar? So when an HOA tells a family, sorry, ramps are unsightly, they're not just making a design choice, they're echoing a pattern of exclusion that civil rights laws were literally written to stop. It's the modern equivalent of telling someone, you can live here, but you can't actually use your own front door. That's not just inconvenient, that's discriminatory. Think about it. Accessibility isn't charity. It's not some favor communities grant out of kindness. It's a right. And rights don't depend on whether your neighbors think your ramp matches the color of the community clubhouse. They're non-negotiable because dignity isn't optional. And yet, despite decades of progress, these ramp disputes show how fragile accessibility can be when left in the hands of small local powers. Every time an HOA blocks a ramp, it's not just one family struggling. It's a reminder that the fight for disability rights is still unfinished. It shows how easily bias can be dressed up in respectable language like aesthetics or uniformity. And it shows why watchdogs like HUD exist, to make sure the promises of civil rights laws don't get trampled by the pettiest level of government, the neighborhood board. Let's put it in a broader context. Across the country, there are more than 50 million people living with some form of disability. That's not a niche group. It's a massive segment of the population. And as America ages, that number will only grow. So when HOAs deny ramps, they're not just inconveniencing one family. They're sending a message to millions. You don't belong here unless you fit our idea of normal. It's exclusion dressed up in HOA letterhead. Now, here's where the hypocrisy shines. HOAs love to brag about community values. They'll print it in glossy newsletters, slap it on websites, and announce it at annual meetings. But what value is being defended when you deny someone the ability to enter their own home? Is that community or is that conformity? Because real community isn't about everyone's house looking identical. It's about everyone being able to live there with dignity. And let's not ignore the optics. When stories like this hit the news, they become symbols. A ramp denial doesn't just affect one cul-de-sac in California or Florida. It resonates nationally. It sparks outrage, mobilizes advocates, and reminds the public that accessibility isn't something we can take for granted. These little battles are part of a much bigger cultural war, the one between exclusion and inclusion, between aesthetic uniformity and human dignity. Here's the bottom line. Every ramp denied is a reminder that civil rights aren't self-enforcing. They have to be defended, again and again, sometimes on the smallest battlefields. And that's why these HOA stories matter. They're not just neighborhood gossip. They're frontline skirmishes in a national conversation about who gets to belong, who gets to be included, and whether unsightly is still being used as a polite word for unwelcome. And that brings us to the grand finale. The lessons learned. Because if there's one thing ramp battles teach us, it's that HOAs can cling to power, homeowners can fight back, but in the end, the real question is, what kind of communities do we actually want to build? After all this drama, letters, denials, legal battles, bad press, and HOA board members clutching their pearls over aesthetics, what do we actually learn from a single fight about a ramp? More than you might think, because tucked inside these neighborhood skirmishes are some big truths about law, power, and what kind of communities we want to live in. First lesson, rights beat rules. HOAs can write all the covenants, conditions, and restrictions they want, but federal civil rights law will always outrank them. The Fair Housing Act doesn't care about your Tuscan-inspired theme. It cares about whether a disabled person can access their home. That's not just legal precedent. That's a fundamental principle of fairness. And every time a judge rules against an HOA, it reinforces the idea that dignity isn't up for debate. Second lesson, aesthetics are fragile, dignity is permanent. A ramp might change how a house looks from the curb, but what it represents is far more important. It's a bridge, literally and figuratively, between exclusion and inclusion. When a community says yes to accessibility, it sends the message, people matter more than appearances. And honestly, what's uglier? A simple wooden ramp or a neighborhood that makes grandmothers crawl through the back door? Third lesson, HOAs thrive on intimidation. Most people won't fight back because they don't have the time, money, or energy. HOAs know this. They weaponize the process. Endless forms, long delays, constant nitpicking. But here's the twist. The law flips the power dynamic. Homeowners who push back, document everything, and escalate to HUD or the courts often win. Persistence, not perfection, is the secret weapon. Fourth lesson, bad press is kryptonite. HOAs hate nothing more than seeing their names in headlines next to words like discrimination and wheelchair. One viral story can undo decades of carefully curated community values. So while boards think they're protecting property values by banning ramps, they're actually torching them with national embarrassment. If property values had a villain, it wouldn't be ramps. It would be arrogant HOAs. Fifth lesson, these fights aren't just local, they're cultural. Each ramp battle is part of a larger civil rights story. It's the 21st century reminder that accessibility isn't optional. Just like sidewalks, crosswalks, and elevators became standard over time, ramps are part of the infrastructure of dignity. Every HOA that denies one is clinging to the past, while every homeowner who fights back is pushing the community toward the future. And finally, the biggest lesson, what kind of community do we actually want? Because when you strip away the legalese, this isn't about ramps. It's about values. Do we want neighborhoods where appearances matter more than people? Do we want communities that actually live up to the word community? Places where everyone belongs, where dignity is protected, and where inclusion isn't just tolerated but celebrated? The ramp wars force us to face those questions. And the answer, at least from the law's perspective, is clear. Ramps win. Accessibility wins. Humanity wins. HOAs that don't get the memo, they lose. Sometimes in court, sometimes in the press, but always in reputation. So yes, a wooden ramp might look simple, but in the grand scheme of things, it's a symbol of something much bigger. The victory of rights over rules, dignity over design, and people over property values.